Hi everybody, welcome to Big Sky Sounds. I'm Anna Page with the Billings Symphony. Super excited to bring you a conversation today with Kevin Cole and our maestra, Ann Harrigan. We're going to chat Gershwin today and all kinds of American composers because we have a wonderful concert that Kevin Cole is joined the Billings Symphony for. Welcome to Big Sky Sounds, you two.
Thank you. My first time here, thanks to Ann. And I'm really looking forward to all the wonderful things that the Magic City, I've heard it's called. And I learned why it's called that is because of the railroad coming through and how fast Billings became a major city out here. So it was pretty fascinating to do a little homework, but also to find out how many cultural events go on in the city at any given time. So this is the next few days will be really nice for me.
Well, we are a busy burg. We have so much going on here. We're super excited to have you come play piano. And music director of the Billings Symphony, you're always cooking up something fun. But you got to conduct Kevin in the past over in Battle Creek, Michigan, which is how you came into contact?
Yes, it is. The funny thing about it is I got to know Kevin through a longtime friend of mine, somebody who has been here to Billings several times, well beloved, the tenor Doug LeBrecq. And I was working with Doug on a concert in Battle Creek, Michigan, which is my other orchestra, and he said to me, do you mind if I bring Kevin Cole here? You know, he lives in Michigan. Well, I have known Kevin's name forever and sort of worshipped him from afar and thought of him as frankly unattainable. And so I was like, Kevin Cole lives in Michigan? Well, yes. And Kevin was very kind to come, and he did some really fun things.
Did some solo playing, but then accompanied Doug on pieces, but also played the piano part for several of the orchestrations of these marvelous Broadway roles that Doug has had. And after the concert, Ann says to me, okay, I want to bring you back to play with Battle Creek, and let's do the Rhapsody. And I said, sure. And she's Johnny on the spot, because it's not like 5 years later it happens. It's like within 1 or 2 years. And so last season I played with Battle Creek Symphony, and she put together this marvelous American composer program featuring some Gershwin. And then after that was over, and it was really, well, there was still some COVID going on, but it didn't matter. The audience had a great time. We had a great time. And she immediately said to me, all right, I'm bringing you to Billings. And she says, have you ever been? I said, no, I don't know anything about Billings. So she said, well, we're going to make this happen. And so here we are.
Well, lucky us, and you know, your connections with the Battle Creek Symphony, bringing those musicians here into Montana and vice versa. Well, you know, how do you program when you look to a season? Because we're really excited to have Rhapsody in Blue that opened the Billings Symphony's classic concert of all American composers, living and deceased. How'd that come about?
Well, it came about because of Rhapsody in Blue. So, and that is oftentimes what happens is I'll pick the soloist first. And it's true. I mean, I've done Rhapsody in Blue with a lot of pianists. Kevin really is the master of the piece in terms of the interpretation, the studying he's done. Many historical research foundations go to him for advice, you know, about how it was done. And it was such an energetic performance. So I knew I was going to have to bring him here. And then it's like, how do you build a program around it? And so that's what happened. And so what do you do with Rhapsody in Blue? You know, and also the other thing is Joe Sample, who is a longtime Billings native. It's his favorite piece, and I've had it on my list to do for a long time. You know, I was just kind of waiting for the right time and the right person. I remember that Ignacio, our former executive director, had said, "What would you do it at Symphony of the Park?" I was like, "Well, you could, but you really want to do it in a concert hall, you know, because of the acoustics." And so that's sort of the long and short of how we ended up with it on our opening concert. And then adding to it Porgy and Bess, the symphonic suite, also written by Gershwin, orchestrated by Robert Russell Bennett, and kind of bookending with some different things. New York, New York, On the Town, 3 dance episodes by Leonard Bernstein, which has the tune New York, New York, a Wonderful Town in it, which was a Broadway revival just a few years ago, a lot of fun. And then incorporating a Michigan premiere an almost world premiere by 1 day.
One day it would have been the world premiere in Billings, but
Yes.
it is the Montana premiere.
It is the Montana premiere of Jennifer Higdon's Cold Mountain Suite, the opera based on the book, which also inspired the movie Cold Mountain. So that was fun because our first rehearsal was the second orchestra in the world to play this piece, a new piece for which there was no recording, and it was only the second orchestra because the Delaware Symphony was on Eastern Time. And so the Delaware Symphony performed the piece on Friday, and we premiere on Saturday.
Oh, what a great lineup of music. And Kevin, Gershwin is in your heart and in your fingers and your soul. Why Gershwin? Where did this come from for you?
Well, I started piano lessons only because, and I believe this, is because my aunt in Detroit, Michigan, which is 100 miles south of Bay City, Michigan, that's my hometown, she was getting rid of a piano. And it was my dad's sister, and he had had piano when he was a kid for 3 years and then switched over to trumpet. So he was hoping one of his 3 boys, I'm the youngest of 3 boys, would maybe take up something in music. So he sat us all down. I'm 4, my brother's 8, my brother's 12, and who wants piano lessons? We're getting this piano in the house. And I was the one that said yes. I was itching for something. And they knew the way I reacted when music was played. And back in the ancient days, they had records. And I was always gravitating to the record department when I'd leave my mom's side when I was 3 and 4. So there was something about me that screamed, give him an instrument. And it could have been anything. I just needed to express myself. Well, this old upright piano came into the house, and I started with lessons. 3 years later, when I was 7, the Late Show movie was Rhapsody in Blue, Warner Brothers picture from, I believe, 1945, and it's Robert Alda, Alan Alda's dad, playing Gershwin. And the movie, the story about Gershwin's life was kind of made up by Hollywood. It wasn't really true to form, but all the musical performers in it, like Al Jolson and Oscar Levant and the original cast of Porgy and Bess, these were real performers, and so you got authentic performances of this music. And at the age of 7, it really hit me hard. Even though I had known the name George Gershwin and had heard bits and pieces of Rhapsody in Blue, it just spurred me on to learn more about him. So on Saturday, we went to the library, which is our day to get our books for the week. And I asked the librarian, I said, look, do you have any books on George Gershwin? And of course, I'm 7 years old, and any of the good biographies would be in the adult section, you know. So my mom had to check it out, but the librarian, before we checked out, said something that really was pivotal in this whole chain reaction of me being involved with Gershwin. She said, well, one of the best books is this one called The Gershwin Years, written by Lawrence Stewart and Edward Jablonski. And did you know that Ed Jablonski is from Bay City, Michigan? And I was like, wow, somebody who wrote a book about Gershwin's from my hometown. So at the time, I couldn't fully read the biography, but I could read captions, look at pictures, and I just made a vow to myself that someday soon I'll get to New York City, where Ed Jablonski lives, and look him up and just let him know that I'm a big fan of Gershwin. So 8 years later, I'm 15 years old, I had arranged an audition for Tanglewood and for their summer institute. And I remember going to the audition, and somehow the audition dates that they gave me to show up were not the right audition dates. Mine had been, I should have been at the ones a week earlier, because these were for the grad students, and I should have been in the ones for, well, the high school part. They let me audition anyway, just to hear me, but that was a bust. But I looked up in the Manhattan phone book, Jablonski, and E for Ed, but there was a whole bunch of Jablonski, E. So I just picked one. And like out of a movie, it was the right one.
Oh, wild.
And Cold called him and said, I'm Kevin Cole, I'm from Bay City, Michigan. I play the piano, and I love Gershwin. And he kind of laughed. And within the course of a 10-minute conversation, he and his wife invited me over the following night for dinner. at their apartment on West 75th in Amsterdam. And he had a little Baldwin upright piano, like they'll spin it. And after dinner, he said, "Would you like to play for me?" And I said, "Boy, would I." And played this medley of Gershwin that I had made up and the first two piano preludes. And when I got done, he said the statement that changed the course of my life. He said, "Has anyone ever told you when you play Gershwin, you sound like Gershwin?" Well, I'd never heard Gershwin play. I'm 15 years old. And I said, "No." So he said, I'm going to put on some radio broadcast, reel-to-reel recordings he had of Gershwin's Music by Gershwin radio show that he had in the early 30s. And he was doing that show to raise enough money so that he could take the time off to write Porgy and Bess, all right? Because he knew that was going to, he wouldn't be able to be out there and concertizing and all that. So for the very first time, I heard Gershwin play, and I got to hear him speak. So Ed said, "Don't you think you sound like that?" And I had to kind of like, yeah, I guess I do. So from that point on, I would go in the summers and stay with the Jablonskis. He had 3 kids, and his youngest daughter was my age. And I would stay with them for several weeks, and then he'd invite over Gershwin's sister, and Kay Swift, and Mabel Sherman, Emily Paley, all the people that knew George and knew his playing. And we'd have these afternoons, and I'd play, and they'd cry, and they thought I was bad, but then Ed said, no, they love it. And from that point, then Ed, because he was a biographer of not only Gershwin, but Irving Berlin and Burton Lane and Harold Arlen and all these people from the golden age of songwriting, I got to meet and play for many of them because they were still living. They were in their 70s and 80s at the time, and they just couldn't get over how much I sounded like George. But what do you do with that when you're 15 or 18 or 20 years old at a time where the music business is so different? Back in the day, if it had been in the 30s or 40s, or maybe even in the early 50s, these people could have picked up a phone and said, "Hey, put them on your show or do this or do that." But by the time they heard me, in their twilight years, most of their contacts were gone.
Right.
But it was an exchange of me going to university or conservatory, which I didn't. I went to school for my senior year at the Interlochen Arts Academy in Michigan and graduated from there. Then I studied privately because I couldn't afford to live in New York and go to Manhattan School of Music, where Robert Goldstand was the teacher that I wanted to study with. So I took some private study with him while staying on friends' couches in Manhattan. And then finally came back to Michigan and thought, well, somehow I'm going to have to let little orchestras know in Michigan that they can hire me. And one of the first ones was the Saginaw Symphony, which is what it was called in those days in Michigan. Now it's called the Saginaw Bay Orchestra. Mm-hmm. And as a soloist, and then word got out from conductors, "Hey, this sounds a little different than what we're used to with Gershwin," and started a career in American music from there. It's interesting when people say you sound like Gershwin, especially in those days, people who actually knew him and did hear him, like as close as we're sitting right now. You stop and think about that and go, okay, why do I sound like Gershwin? And I was born in Bay City, Michigan. I wasn't in Brooklyn. I wasn't as steeped in New York and all that. But the same can be said for Ed Jablonski. Why was he considered the preeminent Gershwin biographer and scholar? And he's from Bay City, Michigan. Well, he wrote a letter to Ira Gershwin while he was in high school, basically a fan letter about George, even though George was already dead by 1937 at the age of 38. And so they became pen pals, he and Ira. Excuse me. Well, in the same way, when I got to Manhattan, I just picked up the phone and called Jablonski and made that connection. But that speaks to the power of the music, to me.
Yeah.
That Gershwin's music can speak to somebody no matter where you are on the planet. And for some reason, it drew me to all these different people, and especially to Ed, who was such a champion of what I did.
Yeah, that's an accessibility through
Excuse me.
through that language of piano and through that art. And when you say sound like Gershwin, what maybe would you, is it a feeling? Is it the way that you play?
Yeah, well, his sisters kind of summed it up when she heard me play for the first time. Frankie, she said, you have that sharp rhythm like my brother had. You have that attack like he had. And the other thing that Ed pointed out was the humor. And it's kind of a funny thing to hear someone say that you make the piano sound funny, but there was a guy, and I forgot who it was, at some party that when Gershwin was playing, made the comment. He says, the only guy I ever heard that made the piano laugh. So there's a joy to it, apparently, that I bring when I play, because I'm not trying to copy him, obviously. In fact, I've never played in public. He did a transcription for solo piano of 18 of his songs, kind of in the style that he would play them when he'd play at parties and whatnot, that improvisational style. But he actually wrote it down, and they're tricky. But for some reason, I never had any desire to memorize those and perform them. There'd be nothing wrong in doing that. But from an early age, I was improvising and creating my own arrangements in his style, I guess. So there's a lot of stride piano playing with it. So that's like Fats Waller and James P. Johnson and Art Tatum. And that's when you're playing an octave and then you play a chord, and you do that very rapidly and very accurately. And then you stretch out to a tenth, instead of an octave is 8. And that brings out other sonorities out of the piano. And so Gershwin could do that. So it's elements. There is ragtime in the background because that's where it stemmed from. But there's also just voicings of chords. It's interesting to hear the Gershwin of the 20s, even in his pop songs, compared to the Gershwin of the 30s when he started writing for film, because he always had a strong melody line, like Jerome Kern did and Irving Berlin. But the accompaniments underneath in the 30s started to get a little more harmonically complex, but they never got in the way of the melody. And that's fascinating to me. Harold Arlen could also do that. And George was a big fan of Harold Arlen's. And what he would do on his radio show, Music by Gershwin, he was not only playing Gershwin, he would promote up-and-coming songwriters like Arlen. And he would give them a leg up on things by promoting them on the air. And so it's interesting to me how, as Irving Berlin said, George is the only one of us that became a composer, because we were all songwriters, and they dabble in it. Mm-hmm. But he really could do multiple things, and would get frustrated when the critics would try to pigeon, well, you should just stick to doing Broadway and not try to do serious stuff. And then the other side would say, oh no, but you should just concentrate on your serious works and give up all that pop stuff. And he just thought, well, you know what, music's music. And it's up to the public to decide which music lasts and which doesn't. So how can I can't deny it. I mean, he was very learned in the sense that he was always studying. It just wasn't formal study. He'd go to a composer or to a professor to learn what he needed for the next task at hand, rather than go for 3 or 4 years and get the degree and all that. So he was attacked for the haphazard way they thought he learned, because he didn't spend all that time in Europe,
right,
like most of them did.
Huh.
And yet, secretly, he was funding new composers' works. Like, he was a big fan of Alban Berg, and Gershwin was the one that underwrote Berg's string quartet, which was one of the pieces that put Berg on the map, so to speak. But most people don't know that. And he was very close friends with Arnold Schoenberg. They played tennis together out in L.A. And so he was part of that world of composers, But just in this country, though, at that time in the 20s and 30s, we were kind of getting a little snobby. And whereas the European composers accepted Gershwin right away, So it's interesting. The attraction for me is that he didn't allow himself to be pigeonholed, because I, too, write songs and write shows that, you know, I hope to get to Broadway. If not while I'm alive, maybe posthumously, they'll dig them up. But I like that idea that even though I studied classical music and was being groomed to enter the Van Cliburn and all these big competitions, that because of what happened, meeting Jablonski and whatnot, I had to make the decision, should I continue with the studies and try to be another classical pianist in a sea of fantastic classical pianists, or should American music be my soapbox and see what happens with that? Of course, somebody would say, you know, you're kind of committing suicide by taking the world's most popular piece, Rhapsody in Blue. And why would they hire you when there's 500 pianists who can play it very, very well? So that was the challenge. But to my credit, if I can credit myself with anything in those early days, is that I have played Gershwin on fewer Pops concerts than I have regular season classical concerts. And that's important, and it was important to me because so many times Gershwin was just delegated to Pops, you know, and that's how booking agents and people would look at it. Oh, it's okay when people are eating their chicken and drinking their, you know, whatever on the lawn. But in the serious hall, I'm thinking, this is 1980s, and Gershwin is still being pushed out of the, he's okay for Pops, but he's not okay for serious. So I lived through many years of that, but I pride myself in that I would say 80% of the time I played Gershwin's been part of the regular serious concert season and not Pops. Nothing against Pops,
Right.
but I just thought, wow, how can there still be this prejudice? It's pretty much gone now, but at that time it was very interesting to me to experience a little bit of what he experienced.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, gosh, Kevin, not only are you the foremost interpreter of Gershwin's music, you are a walking biography of Gershwin. Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, hearing all of this talk too, what attracts you to Gershwin and this music? Obviously, we have to balance the pops, the chicken eating,
Yeah.
so to speak, with some of the more serious works, but Rhapsody in Blue has got to be the most famous composition for piano in America. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with Gershwin's music.
Well, my relationship with Gershwin comes from Ella Fitzgerald.
Oh.
And I had the LP, those old records.
Oh.
I'd worn the grooves out of the Great American Songbook, Ella
Yeah.
Fitzgerald, Nelson Riddle arrangements. I mean, I have every single one, you know, memorized, and I don't even
She's
remember.
got good taste because
Thank you.
that is, if anyone needs an introduction to Gershwin, I point them to her albums because she just has that way. You understand every word, and she always gives the lyric its due, but yet makes it fun and different. And those arrangements too. Nelson Riddle. Oh.
Yeah, they're fantastic. So that's what got me started.
Sure.
And that was fairly early on, I think, in my, you know, understanding of music. I just loved the voice. I loved her interpretations.
Yeah.
And, you know, the American composers, Bernstein,
Oh, yeah.
Gershwin, Copland, you know, Barber. You know, it's very interesting because sometimes I wonder what the Germans think when we play Brahms. Because as much as we try to do it, I know that there's something about an American orchestra, like the Billings Symphony especially. You know, they have an inherent feel for that music that is not easily replicated by other orchestras. And I'm personally starting to learn this a little more with my foray into Irish music.
Yes.
You know, and what Irish musicians think about playing Irish music and American Irish music. There's just a little difference, but there's definitely, we own American music, and it's everything we listened to growing up is a part of that. I also loved swing dance when I was younger,
Yeah.
and so there's the dance tunes, and so, yeah, it resonates with me very deeply. It's been a lot of fun because our concertmaster, Randy Tracy, who one tends to think of as a very traditional musician, has a very strong affiliation with Porgy and Bess. One of his teachers was in the pit for the premiere
Wow.
and knows every note. And I could hear it at the very first rehearsal because there's an inflection.
Yeah.
There's a way of phrasing, and there's a specificity of the phrasing that you don't often hear, especially at the first rehearsal. And I heard it in spades at the front desk, and it was so interesting. And then at the break, Randy was explaining the whole story, and I was trying to talk a little bit to the orchestra because I have a wide range of people. We're talking about in Porgy and Bess, you've got, there's, It Ain't Necessarily So, and there's a boat that's leaving soon for New York, is sung by the charming bad guy, who's trying to lure, Clara away. He does lure Clara away. And it was so interesting at the break that Randy was explaining that to some musicians. Younger musicians, he was telling the story. He goes, I made the mistake of saying, this guy's a real sleaze. He's kind of like Snoop Dogg. Which I shouldn't have said. And a couple of musicians, younger musicians, just raised their eyebrow. How dare you call Snoop Dogg? Charming, So anyways, it was very funny. I just imagine. And so he's got this, I was trying to explain to the orchestra because they have to characterize the music, and then when you have, the Clara, don't be mishearted, don't be sad, and there's this swing to it, and the orchestra, and then there's that rhythm, the kind of samba rhythm, and so understanding all these dance rhythms for players of ours who didn't grow up listening to that, and even though I didn't grow up to it live, there are plenty of movies that you heard, and you heard that style. I remember when I was young, my teacher had us play Begin to Begin. And I didn't like it at the time. I thought,
a little Cole Porter.
Like, what's this, But that rather, that's in Porgy and Bess.
Yep.
And there's a feel to it. And so I think that's part of it, as any American conductor, musician has a certain affinity for those. We call it the Great American Songbook.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that she brings up the dance rhythms because so much of what Gershwin was writing during the 20s especially was based on dance rhythm, popular, especially Charleston. Because when the Charleston took over, and it came out 1923-24, but by 25, 26, that latter part, when the flappers and the women were smoking and bobbing their hair and raising their skirt, that dance craze for the Charleston was, it took over the entire country. And there were big groups of people that thought, you're going to hell in a handbasket if you follow that. But that rhythm, jump, 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 that syncopation was so breakthrough compared to all the other little ricky-ticky kind of stuff going on. There was blues, but to find that punch and that drive, and the begin that Ann just brought up, that's another one. It's all in offbeats. And so Gershwin was very cognizant of current taste and what was going on in pop music, and he'd work those into his big works. And again, they're tools for him to use. But he wasn't the only one, because of Rhapsody in Blue and Concerto in F, then when Ravel did his first piano concerto,
right,
you're hearing those dance rhythms.
So I was thinking, Kevin, we have got to talk about the story of the history of Rhapsody in Blue. And I know you've got so much to talk about, but it's such a big story, and it's I'm sure not a lot of people know it. I have the copy of the original score where it says "Wait for Nod," So please tell us about that.
Well, it was a piece that really shouldn't have happened. It was by accident, in the sense that in 1923, George Gershwin was at a cocktail party, we figure, with popular band leader Paul Whiteman. And Paul Whiteman had this jazz band that had all these fantastic musicians in it. And he was, known as the King of Swing and all this. And, well, it was jazzy, but it wasn't really jazz. But there again, we're talking the early 20s, and we're just getting out of ragtime. So jazz is trying to find itself as far as mainstream, all right? So Paul Whiteman and George are talking at a cocktail party in 1923, and Whiteman expressed how he's going to put together this concert evening in a serious hall, and he thought it was going to be Carnegie Hall, called An Experiment in Modern Music. What is American jazz? So the idea was this concert was going to trace the history of jazz. Now again, this is 1923. The history of jazz is short. So anyway, he says, George, would you write a jazz piano concerto? Oh, sure, I'll do it. Okay. A few months go by, and it's now January 4th, 1924, and in the morning paper, I was reading as George is shooting pool, and it says, oh, Paul Whiteman's doing this experimental music, and Irving Berlin's going to write that, and so and so. And George Gershwin's going to write a is writing a jazz piano concerto. And George goes, I'm doing what? You know, the concert's February 12th. This is January 4th. No way. So he gets on the phone, starts arguing with Paul, and he says, I can't. He says, all right, well, here's what I'll do. How about a Rhapsody? Because concerto is too big a form. I don't have enough time. Rhapsody's free form, can be any length. Fine. He's on a train going up to Boston, George's, and as he's on the train, he's got his tune book with him. He hears that rattly bang of the train going, and he claims that most of the Rhapsody came into his head. Not unlike Mozart, who would compose in his head, and just writing it down was the tedious part. When he got back from Boston, the main arranger for the Whiteman Band was Ferdy Grofé, who most people know from the Grand Canyon Suite. And so he sat at a table while George was at an upright piano. And as fast as George was coming up at things, Ferdy was doing the orchestration for the jazz band, because they had special needs. They had guys that could play up to 5 or 6 instruments, one person. So he had to score it out. But George was telling him, oh no, I want a trumpet there, I want this there, and that. Okay. But he didn't have time to write out his whole piano part, just little snippets. So the night of the concert, which was February 12th, 1924, they couldn't get Carnegie Hall. They had to be at Aeolian Hall. 3 in the afternoon, I think it was a Tuesday, it was snowing to beat the band, lying around the block. They have Rachmaninoff there, they have Efren Zimbalist, they have Alma Gluck, the opera singer, they have Yasha Heifetz, because they were supposed to be the judges at the end of the concert. We're going to say, what's American music? Well, it was all phony, baloney hype. They were there. George's piece, A Rhapsody in Blue, is second from the end of the program. That's just a mixed mash of everything. So here's a dashing George coming out to the piano, and they start the piece. And Paul Whiteman looks very nervous on the stand, because in his conductor's score, where there should have been the piano part when the orchestra doesn't play, there's just a blank part. There was nothing. But he wrote instruction. George was very kind. He said, wait for nod. So can you imagine? Your conductor, did he nod? Okay, no, we go on. But anyway, then the piece took off and everyone wanted to play it, and it made Gershwin basically a big superstar from that point.
Wow.
Yeah.
So much knowledge in you, Kevin Cole. Thank you for coming and sharing with us your love of Gershwin and of the piano. And Ann Harrigan, what a joy always to have you in Billings. And we're going to just wrap it there. That Big Sky Sounds.
Oh my goodness.
Time flies when you're when you're on the TV.
R-H-A-P? Wrap it up?
Wrap it up. Well, thank you both. And yes, we'll have more information on Kevin Cole on our website, billingssymphony.org. Thank you, everybody, for being with us.
Thank you.